A stray's silent plea. The morning air was crisp and carried the faint aroma of fresh bread, drifting from the small bakery nestled between the towering buildings of New York City. The city was already alive, with hurried footsteps echoing along the pavement, taxis honking impatiently, and the occasional laughter of early morning commuters rushing to their destinations. But amidst the bustling crowd, one figure remained still. A golden retriever, his fur matted and unkempt, sat quietly on the sidewalk, just outside the bakery's large glass window. His deep brown eyes, filled with a mixture of hunger and longing, were locked onto the freshly baked loaves displayed inside. Unlike other strays who barked, begged, or scavenged, he did not make a sound. He simply sat there, waiting, hoping. But in a city that never stopped moving, no one stopped for him. A familiar presence. Maria adjusted the trays of warm croissants behind the bakery counter, her hands working automatically as she greeted customers. The cozy shop, Maria's Bakes and Brews, had been in her family for years, passed down from her grandmother. She had seen many stray dogs wandering the streets of Brooklyn, but something about this one made her pause. For the past 3 mornings, he had been there. Same spot, same silent, longing gaze. Never barking, never whining, just watching. Maria wiped her hands on her apron and peered through the glass window. The retriever's thin frame, the slight trembling of his legs, and the way his ears drooped pulled at something deep inside her. He was starving, and yet, despite his desperation, he didn't beg. A customer's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Maria, another espresso, please." She nodded, forcing a smile as she went back to work, but her mind stayed on the dog outside. Why was he here? And more importantly, who was he waiting for? A city that doesn't stop. Outside, the golden retriever's nose twitched as the scent of buttery pastries and warm bread filled the air. His stomach growled. He had gone days without food, but still, he did not move. People passed by, glancing at him briefly before continuing on with their lives. Some looked away in guilt, others simply ignored him. A young man with a coffee in hand hesitated near the entrance, frowning at the sight of the dog. He glanced down at his half-eaten bagel, then at the retriever. A moment of indecision. And then, he tossed the bagel into the trash and walked away. The dog's ears perked slightly, but he remained where he was. Maria saw it all. Her chest tightened. New York was a city of movement. But sometimes it was also a city of indifference. The first step. As the day stretched into afternoon, the golden retriever finally did something different. He moved. Slowly, almost cautiously, he stood and took a few steps toward the bakery door. Maria had just stepped outside to throw away leftover bread when she felt something cold and damp brush against her hand. She froze. The retriever had lifted a paw, gently placing it against her wrist, a silent plea. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had expected the dog to lunge for the bread, but instead, he simply touched her, as if asking for something more than food. As if asking for a chance. The moment stretched. The sounds of the city faded into the background. For the first time since she opened her bakery, Maria felt like time had stopped. A stranger passing by scoffed. "You're not seriously thinking about taking that thing inside, are you?" Maria ignored him. She looked down at the retriever. And in that moment, she made a decision. She opened the bakery door. "Come on, boy," she said softly. For a moment, the dog hesitated, as if he couldn't believe the invitation was real. Then, cautiously, he stepped inside. A warm place at last. The golden retriever shook his body, sending small drops of rainwater scattering onto the wooden floor. Maria grabbed a clean towel and quickly wiped the mess, glancing at the dog as he stood near the counter, his eyes scanning the cozy shop. She expected him to jump at the food, but he didn't. Instead, he sat down quietly, his tail curling around his paws as if waiting for permission. Maria's heart ached. She grabbed a small bowl, filled it with fresh water, and set it on the floor. The retriever licked his lips but didn't move. Maria kneeled beside him and gently nudged the bowl closer. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can drink." Finally, the retriever leaned forward and lapped at the water, his movements slow, as if he were savoring every drop. As she watched him, Maria felt something strange stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. A memory. A golden retriever. A childhood she had tried to forget. More than just a stray. By evening, the bakery had settled into its usual rhythm. Customers had come and gone, and yet the golden retriever remained. Maria had placed a soft blanket in the corner, and the dog had curled up there, his eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. She found herself stealing glances at him, unable to shake the feeling that this was more than just a stray. That he had a story, that he had a past, and that maybe, just maybe, he had been waiting for someone all along. Maria sat down beside him on the floor, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened to you, boy?" The retriever lifted his head and looked at her, his deep brown eyes filled with something Maria couldn't explain, something that made her chest tighten. And in that moment, she knew. This wasn't just a lost dog. This was fate. A stranger with a story. The golden retriever lay curled up in the corner of Maria's bakery, his tail wrapped around his frail body. The soft glow of the hanging lights cast a warm ambience over the wooden floors, reflecting off the freshly baked pastries still displayed behind the glass. Outside, the city never stopped moving. People rushed past the window, oblivious to the story unfolding inside. Maria, however, couldn't ignore it. Every so often, she glanced over at the dog, watching as his chest rose and fell in slow, exhausted breaths. He was not just a stray. Something about him felt familiar, like a ghost from the past, nudging at memories she had long buried. She wasn't sure why, but her heart ached at the sight of him. Something inside whispered that this meeting wasn't an accident. The weight of the past. The night outside deepened, and the bakery emptied out. Maria flipped the sign to closed, signing as she wiped down the last of the counters. A soft thump drew her attention. The golden retriever had lifted his head, his brown eyes locked onto her, studying her movements as if trying to understand who she was. Maria set the cloth down and approached him slowly, kneeling at his side. "Hey there, buddy," she whispered, reaching out a cautious hand. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch, closing his eyes for a brief moment, as if he had been waiting for that simple gesture his entire life. Maria ran her fingers through his matted fur, feeling the sharp ridges of his ribs beneath his coat. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she murmured. The dog let out a soft sigh, pressing his nose against her palm. And that's when she saw it. A thin, faded scar circling his neck. Maria's breath caught in her throat. It was a mark left behind by a collar that had been too tight for too long. Her fingers hovered over the scar, her mind racing. "You belong to someone," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The dog didn't move. He just watched her, as if waiting for her to understand something she couldn't quite grasp yet. And in that moment, Maria knew. This dog had a story. She just had to figure out what it was. An old familiar path. Maria didn't sleep much that night. Instead, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment above the bakery, thinking about the retriever, the way he sat outside her shop for days, waiting, the way he didn't beg, but simply hoped, and the way he looked at her, as if he had known her in another life. It wasn't just his presence that unsettled her. It was what he made her remember, her childhood in Queens. The golden retriever named Max, the only true friend she had ever known. The way he had disappeared one day without a trace, taken away before she ever got to say goodbye. Could it be? Maria shook her head, sitting up with a bitter laugh. "That's ridiculous," she muttered. The thought was absurd. Max would have been long gone by now. But still, the scar on the dog's neck, the way he walked beside her on the way home, never pulling, as if he had once been trained. The way he had led her back to a place she hadn't been in years. Maria swallowed hard. There was only one way to find out the truth: a visit to the past. The next morning, Maria arrived at the bakery early. The golden retriever lifted his head from his spot near the counter, watching as she moved around, but made no attempt to get up. She knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You up for an adventure, boy?" The retriever wagged his tail just slightly, as if he understood. Maria grabbed a leash she had found in the storage room, one that had been left behind by a customer long ago. It wasn't much, but it would do. She looped it gently around his neck, and to her surprise, he accepted it without hesitation, as if he had worn one before. Maria took a deep breath. "Let's go find out where you came from." Hope Haven Shelter. The subway ride to Queens was long and quiet. Maria held onto the dog's leash, watching as he sat calmly beside her, completely unbothered by the movement of the train or the crowds of people rushing past. Another sign. A normal stray would have been nervous. But this dog. He sat with the discipline of a trained companion. Maria's hands clenched around the leash. What if she was right? What if he was someone's lost pet? What if he was Max? No, she couldn't think that way. It was impossible, wasn't it? When they arrived at Hope Haven Animal Shelter, Maria felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. The shelter was small, tucked away between a laundromat and a gas station, with a rusted chain-link fence lining the perimeter. A woman in her 50s, wearing a faded blue sweatshirt and sneakers, stood outside feeding a group of pigeons. Maria approached hesitantly, the golden retriever walking beside her without hesitation. The woman glanced up, her kind eyes settling on the dog. Her expression changed immediately. "Well, I'll be," she breathed, stepping closer. Maria's heart pounded. "You recognize him?" she asked. The woman knelt, her fingers brushing over the retriever's scared neck. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, "He was here once," she murmured. Maria's stomach dropped. The woman glanced up at her. "He showed up at the shelter a few years ago. Someone must have abandoned him, because he still had a collar back then." She sighed. Poor thing didn't take well to being locked in a cage. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't move, just sat there, waiting. Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. Waiting for what? The woman smiled sadly. For someone who never came back. Maria felt something tighten in her chest. Her fingers curled in the dog's fur, searching for warmth, for reassurance. She swallowed. What happened to him? The woman sighed. One night, he just disappeared. Must have broken out somehow. We searched, but he was gone. Never saw him again after that. She shook her head, standing. Until now. Maria couldn't breathe. She looked at the golden retriever. He tilted his head, watching her, waiting. A silent question in his eyes. "Is it really you?" Maria whispered. The dog didn't answer. But he didn't need to. She already knew. And in that moment, her world changed forever. The truth that changes everything. The world around Maria seemed to blur as she stared at the golden retriever. She had to be imagining things. This couldn't be Max. Could it? The dog sat quietly, watching her with the same calm patience he had shown since the day she found him. He wasn't rushing to answer. He was waiting for her to understand. Maria took a shaky breath, turning back to the woman at the shelter. "Are you sure he was here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded. "I don't forget faces, sweetheart. And I sure don't forget dogs like him." She smiled sadly. He wasn't just any stray. He was looking for someone. Maria's chest tightened. Had he been looking for her? After all these years, the weight of time, the subway ride back to Brooklyn was silent. Maria held the leash loosely in her hands, staring out at the tunnels flashing past. She had found part of the story, but there were still too many missing pieces. How had Max ended up at the shelter? Who had abandoned him? How had he survived all these years on his own? The golden retriever rested his head on her lap, sighing deeply. Maria ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth of him beneath her hand, a feeling she had lost so long ago. "I'm sorry, Max," she whispered. The name slipped out before she could stop it. The dog's ears perked up. Maria's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she saw something shift in his eyes. Something like recognition, as if he had been waiting for her to say it. A lump formed in her throat. "It is you, isn't it?" she murmured. The golden retriever gently licked her hand, his tail thumping against the floor of the subway car. And just like that, she knew. Coming home. The moment they stepped into her apartment, Maria felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Max walked in, as if he had been there before. He moved slowly, surveying the room, not with hesitation, but with familiarity, like he had been waiting to come back. Maria watched him carefully. And then, without warning, Max did something that made her heart stop. He walked to the small wooden bookshelf near the window, a shelf Maria rarely touched, and he nudged it with his nose. Her eyes widened. Max had done the same thing when they were kids, pushing open a tiny gap behind the books where she used to hide things from the world. With trembling fingers, Maria reached behind the books, feeling for something she hadn't touched in over 15 years. And then, her fingers brushed against something soft. She pulled it out, a worn, faded blue bandana. Max's bandana, the one she had tied around his neck the day before he was taken away. Maria stared at it, her hands shaking. She looked at Max. His tail wagged slowly, his brown eyes locked onto hers, like he had been waiting for her to remember. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. "You never forgot me," she whispered. Max moved closer, pressing his forehead gently against her chest. Maria's breath hitched, and she finally let the tears fall. A love that never fades. The days that followed felt surreal. Maria still struggled to wrap her head around it all. How Max had found her. How he had survived all these years. How, despite everything, he had never stopped looking for her. She spent hours just sitting with him, whispering stories from the past. About Queens, their old walks, the days they spent hiding from the world together. Max listened. He always had. One night, as Maria sat by the window with a cup of tea, Max curled up at her feet. The city lights flickered outside, the sounds of cars and footsteps fading into background noise. For the first time in years, Maria felt whole. She reached down, running her fingers through Max's fur. "You were always supposed to come back," she said softly. Max sighed contentedly, closing his eyes. Maria smiled. She didn't need answers anymore. She didn't need to question fate. Because some bonds never break. Some love never fades. And sometimes, a dog doesn't just find his way home. He finds his way back to the one person who needed him all along. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.